Good morning, everyone. My name is Susan McElrath. I am the chair of the Librarians Association of the University of California, Berkeley Division, also known as LAUC-B. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Reimagining Libraries Through Critical Library Practices. LAUC-B has been sponsoring conferences of this kind every couple years since the mid-1990s. I wanted to highlight a few points about this conference. This is the first time that the conference committee has included members from other University of California campuses in addition to Berkeley. It's also the first time the conference has been held online. These changes increased accessibility to the planning for the event and facilitated greater access to participation in the conference, which mirrors the increased diversity and accessibility that we are seeking in our profession. I am pleased to introduce Jeff Mackey-Mason, the University Librarian and Chief Digital Scholarship Officer here at the University of California, Berkeley. Jeff is also a professor in the School of Information and the Department of Economics. His research and teaching mixes mostly economics and some computer science and a bit of cognitive and social psychology. Jeff earned an AB in Environmental Policy from Dartmouth College, a Master of Public Policy from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Critical thinking has been central to the vision of liberal education since the late 1800s, and it's a core tenet of librarianship. The basic definition of critical thinking is the analysis of facts to form a reasoned judgment. Of course, how one applies critical thinking is dependent on personal and social context and the historical moment. In particular, one's manner of thinking critically will be affected by one's biases, especially those that are implicit, because the implicit biases are those that every individual carries that are largely unconscious and thus the hardest to offset through careful, thoughtful practice. That we are all subject to implicit bias is fundamental to the human condition, and it's thus inescapable. All humans necessarily use heuristics, which depend on imperfect approximations and generalizations. If we did not, our brains couldn't process the vast amount of stimuli that flood our senses every moment that we are alive. Thus, for every individual in every generation, there is a challenge to examine our heuristics, our assumptions and rules of thumb, a challenge to examine our preconceptions and generalizations and stereotypes, a challenge to make effort to understand and overcome the influence of our biases on the conclusions we reach and the actions that we take. In short, as Lau and Chan wrote, critical thinking includes identification of prejudice, bias, propaganda, self-deception, distortion, misinformation, etc. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, in 1995 affirmed that critical thinking is important for human rights education, leading to tolerance. Of course, we and UNESCO aim for more than tolerance, which might be seen as passive. We aim for action. In particular, in the context of our work as an academic library, we want our actions, our curating and collecting, our instruction, our research guidance and support to advance a more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and just world. I commend LAUC-B for choosing the theme of this conference, Critical Library Practices as a Lens for Reimagining Libraries. You have many thoughtful speakers and a number of engaging, thoughtful posters. I encourage all of us to open our minds, to challenge and think critically about what we hear and read, and to come to reasoned judgments that affect our daily actions. I want to thank Shannon Keeley and Corliss Lee for inviting me to welcome you to this exciting conference and enjoy the conference and get a lot out of it. It's of course not just for enjoyment. Think hard and move forward towards action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for your inspiring words. Thank you for giving us the support and resources to put on this conference that is free for everyone to attend. And thanks to LAUC-B and Susan McElrath for your support as well. So I'm Shannon Keeley. I'm co-chair along with Corliss Lee of the LAUC-B 2021 Conference Committee. And we have an amazing program for you today. Please help me welcome committee member Cristina Velasquez-Fidler, who will provide us with a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, we recognize that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone peoples. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since this institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. We honor the approximately 9,000 ancestral remains and the 490,000 Indigenous artifacts that are still held by UC Berkeley. We ask all attendees to reflect on their own institution's relationship with the Native people on whose land they occupy. We also acknowledge our own responsibility within our library communities to center Indigenous voices in our work, in our collections, and in our approaches to access. How can we better engage with the community whose unceded ancestral lands we operate on? This land acknowledgement is a call to action to revisit our own practices wherever we work. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. And now I would like to offer our conference attendees an active way to contribute to the Ohlone tribe through the Sogorea Te Land Trust. The Sogorea Te Land Trust is an urban Indigenous women-led land trust based in the San Francisco Bay Area that facilitates the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous people. Our conference committee would like to encourage all who have the ability to contribute to do so by paying the Shumi land tax. The Shumi land tax is a voluntary contribution that non-Indigenous people living on traditional Lisjan Ohlone territory make to support the critical work of the Sogorea Te Land Trust. A link has been provided on the slide, and I'll pop it into the chat too. This land acknowledgement was developed jointly by the conference committee and the Sogorea Te Land Trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for putting the links into the chat so that our participants can follow up on this land acknowledgement and take action. So again, we do have an amazing program, but there's just a little bit more housekeeping. So I want to thank you all for abiding by our code of conduct. In order to initially register, we ask that everyone read and agree to that code of conduct. The link to that will be put in the chat as well, so that you can refresh your memory on what our code of conduct says. Also, the way that we're doing Q&A, we debated about this a lot, and what we've decided to do is so that we can use progressive stacking in our Q&A, we are keeping it in chat. So during our presenters' talks, please put your questions into the chat. If you identify as a member of an unrepresented community, please put an asterisk, so that's Shift-8 on your keyboard, in front of your question so that we can prioritize your voice. Finally, we are recording most presentations, and they will be shared publicly on the Berkeley Library YouTube channel. But there are some that have asked not to be recorded for various reasons. So, you'll be able to tell because the recording will stop and start. So now it is my honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Clara M. Chu. She is the director of the Mortenson Center for International Library Programs and Mortenson Distinguished Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is a leading voice in international and multicultural library and information science, LIS, education, research and practice, Dr. Chu publishes, presents, and consults worldwide in English and Spanish on equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and development in global context, strategic planning, and emerging technologies and trends. She is co-editor-in-chief of Library Trends and co-general editor of the Encyclopedia of Library and Information Science Online. The title of her talk today is Agency in Critical Library Practices, Individual and Collective Action to Undo Inequity. Welcome, Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for that introduction. I'm now going to just begin to share my slides before I get too far. And here you go. Again, thank you, Shannon, for that kind introduction. And I'd like to also thank LAUC Berkeley for the invitation, especially Christina and Erica, whom I've been in communication with to get ready for today. And I also like to say greetings to everyone. And before I get too far, then I'd like to also acknowledge that although I join you virtually, I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that I join you from the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a member of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I take the responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution. So today, I wanted to focus and talk about agency in critical library practices, individual and collective action to undo inequity. And why did I choose this focus? I consider that in order to get to equity, and that means that we need to take a critical approach to library practices, then the onus is on all of us. We have to have the agency as individuals and collectively in our libraries to move the agenda forward and to ensure that the work of EDIA and development in international context is something that we can achieve. There is the word critical. Why is it that we're using it? And the reason that we're using it is that we want to be able to apply a lens where we are taking careful judgment and looking at the good and bad of everything that we are examining. And that means that it's an analytical approach, but not just to think of it in terms of what might be good moving forward or what hasn't worked very well, but the power that is behind it. So when I think about critical, or want you to think about critical, the lens that I want you to use is the power lens. What is that lens that allows something to be given priority? What is it that allows something or people to be given opportunities? And what is it that is creating a barrier? So what is the power that's at play? And what I'm going to share with you draws on the foundation of some work that I've been doing for a long time since I was at UCLA as a professor. And so it's a transformative approach to changing and creating a more diverse, equitable society. And that is that the action that we take has to look at the ABCs. That means we look at the effective. What is it that we think about something? How is it that we feel? And then what action do we take? Even if we think about something that's negative, do we take action? Or do we take it in terms of being more objective and do what's the right thing to do? Or what do we know? Do we know something negative about someone, and so therefore we distrust that person? Or do we think about that person in a positive sense? And so what I want you to think about is to bring your body, mind, and spirit to the process. And what does this process take? One is showing up, being present. Being present means that it's not just being there physically, but the effective. So that's the first step. what is it that you're thinking, and what is it that you know about the situation that you're in. Then next is to learn. What else do you need to know? What do you already want to build upon? And that means conscientization. This particular term I draw from Paulo Freire. Some of you already might be familiar with his work. He was a critical educator who was working in literacy in Brazil, and he wanted to bring literacy to adult learners. But instead of just teaching people to read and write, then he felt that conscientization was important, meaning that you read and you learn to know the world. That means you know the world so you can change it. So it's not just functional literacy, reading and writing and learning so you can get a better job or do better, but to really look at the world, and because you know it for what it is, you're more conscious, then you want to change it because there are things that you can contribute. And then last, to create that change. And that change means to address the injustices. And I'm going to be able to share with you what I call the contributive justice model. So I'm going to share with you these 3 steps in terms of something that I did last Saturday. So here I am at the Women's March that last Saturday with Barbara Ford, whom some of you might know. She is a past ALA president. And so at this Women's March, we showed up. And so when I show up, then who am I? As you can see, I am Clara Margarita Chutai, and my Chinese name is Cho Waiping. So some of you can see that my background is Asian or Chinese, and then that's why I have a Chinese name. And also if you look at my name, then you might see that it might not be a clear English name. And that is because I am a Peruvian-born Chinese Canadian American. I go by she, her, hers, and you can see that I bring to the table lots of different experiences, cultures, some things you can see, and many more that you cannot see. And so it wasn't until age 10 that I celebrated Christmas, because at home, we mainly practice Chinese culture. And so you can see the food that we might have at Christmas is not necessarily a turkey, it resembles more Chinese food. And so when we show up, sometimes we show up, but how do people see us when we show up? And so for some of us who are minority background or other underrepresented backgrounds, then microaggressions may occur. And what is a microaggression? For those of you who are familiar with the term, it's a small behavior, phrase, or other action that exhibits a hostile or derogatory attitude towards a minority. And so when we show up, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always in friendly circumstances. And the reason that is that we often are considered different. We often are considered foreigners. And the reason is that there is that F word that is edged in many of the things that we already label. For some of us, we already know we have foreign language collections. We have foreign language departments in our universities. We may have a foreign language requirement, and we have foreign films, and we have foreign exchange students. For some of us, we have changed that F word to international, world, or non-English. But as we know, when we show up, people know us as the labels that we might be already been taught or we have learned because that is what is shared in the world around us. So however we show up, wherever we show up, it's always good to reflect. Why are we there? What do we hope to see and do? What do we already know about the situation? Why are we interested in being there? And what are our goals for working in that environment? So I want you to think about this in daily life as well as in work. What do you bring when you show up? What do you know when you show up? And so this doesn't just apply to individuals. As I said, we need collective action. And so is your library showing up? And if we look at the diversity and inclusion pathway that was created by diversity partners, they talk about the different stages in terms of an organization and the extent to which they have addressed diversity and inclusion. And so there may be some organizations, they may be libraries that are not showing up. That means that they are in avoidance. There's no recognition of diversity and inclusion. Some might be compliant, and so they are compliant and they're paying lip service, and that's about the extent of it. Some might be doing something programmatic. So there are programs that are addressing diversity and equity, but they're very ad hoc. I think that we are currently in stage 3 and 4 for many of our organizations in our nation. And so stage 3 is that it's now recognized that it's important for organizations to address equity and diversity and inclusion. And so we are promoting it, and it's in our policies. For some of us, then it's an integrated approach because our leadership has recognized that this is important, and everyone in the organization is also taking that leadership approach. And so it's integrated into our systems and structures. And then lastly, it's institutionalized. And it's institutionalized when the organization and everyone in it is accountable for diversity and inclusion. And so I want you to think about this pathway when we get to the third stage, which is to act. So the second stage is to learn. And as I indicated, to be conscious, because when you learn, you can change the world. So here at the March, then we were learning from others who were sharing their experiences and the importance of the issues, as well as there was an information booth where we could pick up materials. So what do we know then? Do we know enough about the diversity, the ethnicity in a particular country? And so if you can see here, then there are many countries that in their census, they don't count or they don't measure ethnicity. And so if that's the case, then it's difficult to know who might be of that background or not, or who might be of other backgrounds or not. And as we know, we count some things and we don't count. And so in many places, people of particular backgrounds may not be counted. And so that has implications for how are you recognized legally, how are you recognized culturally in the country, and potentially many other implications. So this invisibility not being counted, it's also in our history books. So in the history books, then I share with you first on the left-hand side, where in the history of Peru, then after slavery was abolished there, then Chinese laborers were brought in by the Spanish. And here you could see that, or you might not be able to see very well, but this Chinese man was shackled because he might run away. Conditions were so harsh in terms of the labor that they had to do that they were concerned that he would run away. So therefore, he was in shackles. Chinese also contributed to the building of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad when they connected. When they finished building the Central Pacific Railroad and contributed to that, many Chinese died, but in the what is called the celebration, the last spike, then there wasn't a Chinese person at all that was there and pictured for history. And so their labor, their contributions to the building of the railroad has not been documented in this particular celebration of the finishing of the connection of those two railways. Some of us may or may not know about the boarding schools in the United States, the Indian boarding schools, where indigenous families, children, they were taken away and they were put in boarding schools. And so these boarding schools really affected the children in terms of their language being taken away, the forceful teaching of English. And so for some of the generation that came, the children of these individuals, they wondered, why is it that their father was, or their mother always didn't seem like they were happy, or weren't able to live a full life. And so what Denise Lejemudier says is that she had to go on this journey where she had to forgive her father and the way that they were raised, for his temper, his verbal abuse, and for the beatings. So any inequity, any injustice, any oppression that any individual experiences creates trauma, not only trauma for the individual, but trauma for those who are around them. And so we also experience in history, if we look at our history and learn from it, then we see on the upper left, refugees in 1995 or 96, where the Syrian refugees trying to get into Europe. Then to our right, then we see the children that were put into, were interned, and these were the children who crossed from Central America into the United States. And so before that, then very similar in terms of the refugee situation, then Jewish people that were going to be deported, taken to the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And then to your bottom right, then Japanese who were waiting for the train, because they were also going to be taken away, and they were going to be put into Japanese internment camps, and that is in the United States. So wherever we are in different parts of the world, then we can see that there's segregation. There can be extermination associated with the Holocaust, and also persecution or detention. So our history, as we learn about what we have gone through, we have a long way to go to address diversity. Diversity being all the ways in which people differ, and then to try to ensure that there's equity, which is the fair treatment or access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. And so it shouldn't be one's identity that predicts the outcome. And then the inclusion, which is that once you might have the opportunity because an organization is including and having diversity, then that you have the opportunity to have to be able to use your voice, to be able to be part of the decision-making structure in your organization. So when we think about that particular axis in terms of looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, then we also need to think about what we need to do to ensure that we move forward with equity. And that is that we need to ensure that there are equitable opportunities. So where we see that there aren't, that then we advance justice. And so what do we mean by one particular type of justice, which is social justice? And that is the equality of rights for all individuals to benefit from social progress without discrimination. So for our field, when library and information organizations are engaged in promoting social justice, the emphasis should be on library and information services, what, and practices, how, that provide equity of opportunities for both users and non-users of any background to enhance their economic and social well-being, which includes their rights, dignity, and voice, as well as economic, social, and political empowerment. So when we're thinking about social justice, then there was the emphasis on equal distribution. And what I like to introduce to you is this concept of addressing justice through contributive justice. And this particular concept was introduced by Paul Gomberg in his book. And what he wanted to do in this work is to help us understand justice contributively rather than distributively, which is the challenges of unequal distribution of labor and opportunities that can be overcome. And so what he wanted to do is that when we're trying to distribute equally, then there is the challenge. How do we do that? Who's affected? And then what is going to be contributed? And so if we move away from this particular model of trying to identify equitable contribution, what Paul Gomberg wants us to think about is that in a contributive approach, it is not, which means who gets what or the distribution. Rather, justice is achieved by what one gives to others. Who gives what or contribution? So in this particular approach, then it's not that everybody has to receive or distribute something equitably, but what one has to do is if everybody gives, then everybody gives what they can. And so by everybody contributing their labor, their effort, then that means that there is an equal opportunity for everyone. And so there's also a duty to participate in social actions. And and that duty will be equitable too, where we all participate in these social decisions. So the shift in focus is on what we do rather than what we get. And so this is the emphasis that I'm bringing to the table. And so this means that we have to act. So contributive justice during this March, then you can see Barbara was signing a particular petition, and that is a petition regarding rank voting here in Illinois. And so much can happen. So why is it that we need to act? Whenever we have societies, communities that are inequitable, where there is injustice, then it causes trauma. Trauma not just for those who are impacted, but trauma for the whole society. Because even though we don't know it, those who have privilege then will be impacted because their lack of understanding is not going to be always the case. There will be the situation where they will understand that this inequity is causing difficulties, challenges, lack of opportunities, and barriers across the society. And so the experience of trauma that those who have been oppressed, those who have experienced injustice, is the experience or situation that are emotionally painful and distressing, and that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope. So for some of us who have experienced racism, it's not something we always have talked about. Now we talk about it more. Since the death of George Floyd, many of us are speaking up more, and speaking up in terms of owning also the trauma that they may have caused. And so this particular trauma has been suffered by underrepresented minorities for their whole life. And so this brings about chronic adversity, discrimination, racism, and oppression that many of us experience. So how do we deal with trauma, or what are some of the repercussions of trauma and the challenges of injustice? So in the particular case that I wanted to raise is, what do mothers tell their children in terms of how you might deal with situations that are unjust? The African-American mother might teach her Black son the unwritten rules, not to wear a hoodie, to talk a certain way, to not walk in certain places, in certain neighborhoods at night. However, what does a refugee mother do? The refugee mother might stay silent. And I draw from an example which was written up of an experience in San Francisco area. So several weeks ago, Jing Thao, 29, discovered while watching a travelogue on Hmong TV, so Hmong being a group of refugees that live here in the United States, and that his mother was a master artisan in Laos, celebrated for making hemp cloth from scratch. Here in Fresno, she goes back to Hancock Fabrics, Joanne, or Walmart, he observed. I sensed she didn't want to be reminded of herself. So oftentimes when people have experienced trauma, instead of speaking up, then they stay silent to not remember. And so how do we begin healing? Healing begins with the truth. And this is where action has to take place. So healing begins with the truth with, in the example that I'm going to share in Canada. So in Canada, it also had Indian or Native boarding schools. And so in Canada, they held the Truth and Reconciliation process. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an effort to learn more about what happened and the impact on First Nations people. And so it's been found that in Canada, prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 30% of people knew about the Indian boarding schools in that country. But after the TRC, 70% knew the truth about the abuses and tragedies which took place in their country's history. Now, how about here in the US? Do we know about our own Indian boarding schools? So in America, we estimate less than 10% know about the US boarding school era. And that's because we don't teach it in our history books much. And also we have not held our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So how do we act? We have acted by issuing many statements. And most of the statements we probably are familiar with from our higher education institutions. And we also know that they usually use words such as, we stand against, we condemn, we're angry and saddened, we're in opposition to, we encourage, we strongly urge, or we're deeply concerned. And so I want us to move beyond these statements and to action. So I'm sharing the example, which is from the Canadian Academic and Research Libraries Association. And they issued a statement recently on September 29th. And in this statement, it's not just one where it's standing with Indigenous peoples, but they also stated, as you can see in the bullet points, we are committed to educating ourselves and future library professionals. We are dismantling colonialist and racist structures, systems, and practices in our library through education and action. And we're advancing research libraries' roles in implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action. And so you can see statements that we can make them action-oriented. It's up to us. So we can also learn from Australia. We have been doing land acknowledgements in the US following the practice already taking place in Australia and Canada and other places. And so in Australia, then they use two types of acknowledgements. One is welcome to country, and that is performed by an Indigenous person. So it's by a traditional owner of the land. Or you can do an acknowledgement of country, which is what we have done at the beginning of this conference. And so this statement is to recognize the traditional owners of the land. And so these are two opportunities for us. We can do one or the other or both. And how do we go about creating a land acknowledgement statement? Many of our universities have them already. And if not, then we can go to resources that we can find on the web. For example, the one by Amnesty International, or this other one by USDAC. So what else can we learn from Australia? So in Australia, then there are resources that have been documented relating to the Aboriginal communities. And in this particular resource is a database documentation of the Koori people. And so in this particular resource repository, there are images of Indigenous people, deceased Indigenous people. And to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, then seeing images of people who have already passed away can cause trauma. And so they put a warning before one enters into further into the website that there may be sources there that may create trauma. And so therefore, they are making sure that before somebody uses the materials that they recognize the culture and that what happens in that particular community. We also see that in Australia, in the state records of South Australia, they have the cultural sensitivity warning. And so this is very specific regarding access conditions. That means that the particular records of that can only be accessed as indicated by the Aboriginal communities and or depositors. And so these are conditions that the state records archives that they are willing to recognize. And also the Australian media has Indigenous protocols that they can respect the cultural practices of Indigenous communities whenever they're going to have them in any media communication. So whether it's in films, an interview, any form of media. And for some of us who may not know what our traditional lands are, Victor Temprano has created this particular map where he has, excuse me, he has mapped Indigenous communities, the traditional lands of the people. And so one of the important things to learn about what can happen in our libraries is if we do an institutional diversity assessment. And why do we want to do this? It's because we want to learn what the organization's members think about diversity in the library, which is the services and practices. And we also want to identify the diversity gaps which may exist between the current services and practices and the diversity needs of the organization and its members. And then thirdly, we want to provide the information to effectively plan that will meet the diversity needs of the organization. So a diversity audit or assessment of an organization should be an integral part of the library's planning process that is based on facts and not speculation. The findings of this particular audit can be used in the following manner. It can be incorporated into the review of existing vision, mission, values, goals, and our objectives of the information institution and the revision or the development of new ones. They can also be translated into a diversity plan and specific policies, programs, and activities using the findings. And then also the results can be used as a benchmark from which to gauge progress in the future. And so when I lead individuals in institutional diversity assessments, one of the first activities that I do would be to audit the library's community profile and strategic direction. And so that might be then looking at the vision mission statements. So the questions I would ask is, are diversity and inclusion, equity, and accessibility explicit in the vision, mission, values, and goals and strategic directions? And so if you look at the one below, we are taking just Berkeley Library as an example. So the mission is we help current and future users find, evaluate, use, and create knowledge to better the world. So we ask ourselves, is there enough that addresses diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility there? The vision, which is what we want the library to try to aim for, is that the university library will be a leader and partner in creating and implementing ideas and services that advance research, teaching, and learning. So we ask ourselves again, is there enough that is stated regarding equity, diversity, and inclusion? And then here, we're not going to go and look at your strategic directions and other statements or your whole strategic plan. But if there isn't enough that's indicated, is there a separate diversity statement? And why is there a separate diversity statement? Should it be separate because it's also a priority, or should diversity be more fully integrated? So these are questions you can ask. And then what indicators are being used for measuring diversity, inclusion, and equity? Are they appropriate? If not, what would be better measures and why? So I'm just going to share a few other examples of what we can continue to learn from others and what others are doing to address equity, diversity, and inclusion. And as the conference is on reimagining, so I'm not going to give you specific steps that you should take, but all of these, this three-prong approach is a way to encourage you to take action that you can reimagine your library. And so one would be consider multilingual access if that's appropriate. And we find that in many of our libraries, then this multilingual access is not provided. Does your community have an international community? If you aren't in an academic library, you're in a public library. Is there a multilingual community in your public library? Would multilingual access be appropriate? Then we know that in university libraries, there have been reflection or meditation rooms that have been created. And this is to ensure that there is a space where individuals who would like to have time and space to reflect, meditate, or say a prayer, that they can do so. So these rooms allow us to be able to practice either prayer, meditation, yoga, or mindfulness. And I want to show you another example, and this one is from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. What they have done with this one project, which is on the books, Jim Crow and Algorithms of Resistance, they're using artificial intelligence to be able to convert collections as a source of data for education, reparation, or research. And what they're trying to explore with this particular project is, can text mining and machine learning identify racist language in legal documents? So the machine learning is trying to examine if there is particular language that is racist in these documents, and we can learn and then ensure that we don't continue to use such language. And in terms of how is this project funded, it's part of the university libraries at UNC, their Reckoning initiative. And so many of us can also follow this example. The Reckoning initiative at the university libraries at North Carolina, Chapel Hill, is a commitment to go beyond a mere focus on diversity and instead to use equity, inclusion, and social justice as a lens for all our work. And so they have featured some of their work, and also they have made funding available for such work. So some of this work is also being done, and I think that one of the shifts that we can see is that not only are individuals interested in addressing EDI in research or in practice, but it is also something that is being recognized as projects that and work that should be done. And so I'm just sharing the example from the Canadian Association of Academic and Research Libraries, and that of the 3 winning research projects, then 2 of them were on diversity. And so we can see that this work is being advanced and there is interest in it. And now I want to just shift a little bit and look at diversity in terms of some global work that we're doing at my center. So my center is focused on a mission to strengthen international ties among libraries and librarians worldwide for the promotion of international education, understanding, and peace. And so when I joined the Mortensen Center, then I decided that the focus on peace was critical in our work. And so we have a Libraries for Peace platform where we share resources so people can learn. We also have a map where people can contribute their particular actions on Libraries for Peace, and also it's an opportunity to share knowledge. And so learning, acting, and sharing is also possible through that platform. So we also have been doing some work to respond to the question of what is the role for libraries in communities which are disconnected or experiencing inequities and challenges. And the work that we have, or the initiative that we have come up with, is called CLIA, Community Library Interaction. So CLIA responds to community needs by supporting libraries to facilitate local dialogue and community action. So what is taking place is that we bring communities together and facilitate a conversation in the library. And that conversation is about their concerns, and not just their needs that we can address, but what is going on in their lives, what experiences are challenging, what may be something that they would like to change in their lives. And so after the initial conversation, then we start to identify what some of those challenges are. Then we ask, is the community wanting to address those? And if they are interested, then they can start to initiate what might be a way to get organized and get that started. And so that leads to action. And so this action is done by the community. Where the library comes in is that we have facilitated the dialogue and we're supporting the action. CLIA is about empowering the community to act. And then so through their actions, it leads to social transformation. And so the emphasis is teaching to fish rather than just providing for the needs. So it's working with communities and not just for communities. And so this particular approach, which is CLIA, emphasizes 3 core values: democratic dialogue, social cohesion, inclusion, equality, and diversity, and inform civil and civic action, meaning that a lot of the action that will be taken will improve the civic conditions of individuals in the community. And then civil, meaning that the action of dialogue is one where difficult issues may be brought up, there may be disagreements, but the conversation is to listen and to respect differences. And so the conversation is one where we recognize and respect differences which are civil in nature. So the theoretical concepts of this work is that libraries are community anchors. They work together with their communities. So then the communities can also work with their organizations for collective impact. It is an active citizenship model that also brings people together to work in community engagement, libraries with their communities that lead to social transformation. And so this work was not done just, a few librarians coming up with this idea, because one of the critical aspects of community connecting with libraries is to learn from them. And so we held the first lab at the University of Illinois, where we brought teams together. So we had teams of public library cases, academic library, and also the iSchool. And in each particular team that came together, it wasn't just the librarian. So it would always be the library administrator, a librarian, a volunteer, and a community member. So in terms of the academic library, it would be an academic library user. And so the teams came together. We designed our process at the University of Illinois, and then we took what we learned to Colombia, and in Bogota, Colombia. Then we shared what we have done, and we wanted to see if what we had developed made sense and worked in Colombia. So the process was international in nature. So I just want to give one example of a particular conversation. And this, we've been mainly working with public libraries, but I will show you some of the work that we've done with academic libraries. So we have been doing workshops, and in this particular case, then this conversation I helped to facilitate of a public library in Lima. And the conversation was with vendors at a market. And so you can see some of the librarians and some of the vendors in conversation. And we were able to ask, what is it that they wanted to change in their lives? What would help improve their situation? And so of the many things that were brought up, then one thing that was indicated was they wanted to be able to have credit card transactions. They didn't know who to trust, and they didn't know how one went about making those decisions of having, being able to process credit card payments. And there were especially many tourists who would come to their market and they weren't able to provide that particular service. And so that was one of the many things that were said. Then you see the young lady in the pink top, and she was very quiet. She was the only one that wasn't sharing anything. And so I, at a point where everybody had an opportunity to talk, then I asked her, what is it that would help change her life? And she said, no, she didn't really want to share. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll try prompting in a different way. I said, if you were to wake up tomorrow morning and you have a smile on your face, you know, what is it that had changed? And so she said again that she didn't really want to participate or contribute and say anything. And then the lady who is to her left said to her, and that's her aunt, you know, tell them. If you don't tell them, who's going to help you? And so her story is that she didn't, in Peru, you have to have a national ID to be able to conduct many transactions. And so she didn't have her national ID because her name did not match her birth date that her parents recall. And so they had hired a lawyer, her family, but because they're of low income, the lawyer, I don't know if they did their job very well, but the lawyer was not able to go through the national database to be able to match, find a record where her name would be matched to the birth date that she remembered. And so the librarians who were at this meeting, they said to them after the conversation that we had, here are a few names of some organizations that you guys might consider approaching. And so here, not long after that particular conversation, there is our young woman, and she has her national ID. And she has her national ID because what they did is they followed those particular leads, and all on their own, they were able to get the national ID. And now she can get finish her high school education, get her high school certificate, and actually officially get a job. Without her national ID, she could not get an official job. And so after that particular workshop and facilitation, then we were able to get a grant from Iberbibliotecas, and we have worked with 3 countries on 28 projects with community and public libraries. And so one of them was the one with the vendors. So once we got the grant, we were able to go back to the vendors and ask them, you know, what project would you like to work on? And so they said they wanted to work on the one with the credit cards. So they were able to participate in a financial literacy workshop, and also they were able to get a mini grant from our project, and 11 of the vendors were able to receive a credit card processing machine. So now I just want to end with the example of CLIA Colombia Universidades. So in Colombia, we're working with the CLIA process with private universities in Colombia. And these private universities have a social commitment to the communities that are around them. Many of them are located in communities that are very low income and where there may be conflict, violence, etc. And so the libraries are starting to work in community projects. And the example that I want to provide is just one here from the Universidad de La Salle. And what they did is they did information literacy workshops. And the way that they apply CLIA is not just to teach the local community and others about information literacy, how to find information, but what they decided to do it is that they would also ask the community members, how is it that they find information? What is it that they consider to be a source that was authoritative or a source that they could trust? And so the information literacy sessions were always conducted from the perspective of the community. What did the community consider information? What did the community consider information sources before the librarians were shared what databases were available at the university library and other resources? And so the last invitation, or the last thing that I want to share is an invitation to participate in engineering change in libraries. We will be soon conducting our Mortensen Distinguished Lecture, and that will be presented by Dr. Agnes Kaposi. She is a Holocaust survivor and also an engineer. And she wants to be able to use her experiences to be able to create a more just society. And so we have designed not only for her, invited her to do the lecture that sets the context. So the lecture will be November 8th and it'll be virtual, but we will be following it up by 2 workshops that will facilitate library staff to take action. Because what she wants to be able to do with this particular engineering change series is for us to understand the other and mobilize libraries to provide more effective and equitable services and programs to underserved communities. And to ensure that we don't look at things just, how we might traditionally, then a critical approach that we're taking to this lecture is for after Dr. Kaposi does her lecture, then there will be a conversation with Dr. Valerie Matsumoto, and she is a professor of history at UCLA, and her research has to do with Japanese American history and the internment experience. And so there will be a conversation where there will be comparative understanding conversations regarding internment, the Holocaust, and other critical issues regarding otherness, exclusion, propaganda, and dislocation. So I want to end with Paulo Freire. I had indicated that I have introduced the concept of conscientization, which comes from his work. And we are celebrating his 100th birthday on September 19th. And so many people around the world have had conferences to be able to celebrate his work. And I want to end with a quote that comes from his work, which is, "The radical committed to human liberation does not become the prisoner of a circle of certainty within which reality is also imprisoned. On the contrary, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can better transform it." Conscientization. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. This person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people, or the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she does not commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side. So I conclude with thanking you, muchas gracias, and to act side by side to ensure that we can undo injustice and inequity. And now I'll open up for questions. in a conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Chu, for your wonderful talk. We have several questions that we've gathered. Please, attendees, put your questions into the chat. Remember to put an asterisk, shift 8, if you identify as a member of a marginalized community so that we can prioritize your questions. I'll start with one. And we're getting lots of love in the chat, also, Dr. Chu. So one question that we have is, if healing begins with truth, how can libraries deal with issues like holding artifacts they should not hold, or holding collections by questionable figures, like cultural sensitivity warning, something like that? How have you seen this dealt with well, or maybe not well?
I think that there's still resistance. So some libraries, cultural heritage institutions may not have. And I think that if we can have conversations with the people whose artifacts or whose work we have in our collections or we haven't represented. So if there's an invisibility, then how do we ensure that we bring them, into our collections? Would they be willing to donate materials? Would they be willing, or their communities, to be interviewed, right? Oral history. And so the hard conversations are, how do we let go of something that we've been managing, preserving, curating? And so I think that that issue has to come from recognizing that we are a collective, that something that belongs to us is something that we're just keeping. But if we can speak with our communities that are impacted, where did this originally come from? If they can share with us how they would like to keep it, or they would have like to have it in their own possession, and then we can talk about how it's important for us to keep it. I think that those conversations are long ones and they're not easy ones. And so it's not like you'll have one meeting and then, we'll give up our stuff because we know and we can trust that it'll be taken care of by others. Or it might also, that conversation is not going to be, oh, you guys keep it, we know you're doing a great job. But it's going to be a hard conversation and a very lengthy set of conversations that will lead to hopefully some agreement. And I think that if we look to our Indigenous communities and how decision-making takes place, it's always through long, lengthy conversations until a conclusion and it's agreed upon everybody. So it's not just, let's take a vote and the majority wins. And so if we can look to those different ways of acting and respect that, if we still have the possession, for some of us, if you were a refugee, your possessions are gone, right? All you have is what's on your back. And so if we have any possessions at all, why not see how we can manage it together, how we can respect the culture that it comes from? And I think that way, then it's a win-win for all.
Thank you. And yes, as you said, it takes time to build that trust with those communities, especially if it's, if having these things is breaking that trust, building that trust back so that they can be part of these solutions and get their honest answers about what they want done. So really appreciate that, because I'm thinking of the story you shared, the woman in the pink shirt with her documentation, and it took her a while to tell you what she needed. So next we have a question that came in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Chu. This is them, not me, was wondering if you could speak to how you have seen things change in terms of addressing inequality in LIS, or how your own trajectory has changed as LIS has changed.
I think it's a combination. I think LIS has come a long way. Something that I didn't get to talk about is how I started to do work in EDIA, and that is when I was doing library and information, studying for library and information science. I did have one course that was available at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, where I did my PhD. And I always thought, oh, okay, that's really nice, right? All this, it was called multicultural. And so that was really nice. But when it came time to do my PhD, which I also did there, then I didn't think about diversity as something I could do, because I always thought, oh, you know, that's nice, but it was always my community work. So I was doing quite a lot of community work, really helping to lift up, you know, the Asian American, or not the Asian American, Chinese Canadian, the Chinese Canadian and the Latino community there. But I always thought it was just something I did on the weekends, in the evenings, and never thought about it being appropriate for research at all. And so it was only closer, you know, to me finalizing my proposal when my supervisor said, oh, my partner just told me that you were at this meeting and you're doing all this work with the Chinese community. How come you're not doing any research on that? I said, oh, I didn't think it was worth it. I didn't think it was important. And so I promised myself I would finish that topic, but I would use all my research knowledge. And then once I moved to a faculty position, that's when I would start doing research in this area, and I would commit to building. And so it's been slow. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think that there is more awareness, and I hope that awareness moves to conscientization and people want to act. And this is where, like, if we can pivot and act, that's the most important. To feel like something needs to be done is not enough. That's just the feeling. Yeah.
So in line with what you just said, this pivot to action, a question, and I'm selfishly going to ask a question that I wanted to ask, which is, do you have any examples of an academic library or any library focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion in their strategic planning process? I love that you showed a statement from our strategic plan at UC Berkeley Library and gave us a little bit of a critique there. So my question to you is, in a strategic plan where they make room for to prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, can you share examples, if you've noted, what kinds of work do they deprioritize so that they don't burn out their staff? Because that's a concern I have as somebody who's in administration.
Mm-hmm. So I don't worry about, I guess, staff burning out. I think if it's integral to our mission, then it's the work that we're doing every day. So it's not like, oh no, you know, well, we have to make sure that there is this new area. I think for me, it's always been business as usual. And so what I would encourage, and I haven't seen it yet, maybe there is a particular strategic plan that is like the one I'm envisioning. And what I would like to see, if you search SMARTIE goals, like SMARTIE, then there is a particular approach to writing goals that are SMARTIE. So SMART is what we've always written up, right? So which is a strategic, measurable, realistic, time-bound, etc. And achievable is the A. SMARTIE is I for inclusion, E for equity. And in A is not for achievable, A is for something else. But in any case,
accessible?
No, it's even further. So the writing SMARTIE goals emphasizes inclusion and equity. And so every statement that you write, it's not just a diversity statement, but if you are trying to increase users, then what aspect of equity and inclusion will be there? And it also forces you to push the boundaries of your organization. Like, what can you do that is super radical that will really ensure equity and not just increase use, right? So take a look at that example. If everybody can write a strategic plan with SMARTIE goals, then we're there.
Thank you. That's the first time I've ever heard of SMARTIE goals, so that's very exciting. I think we have time for one more question. We have 2 minutes left, and people are saying ambitious in the chat for
yes,
the A.
That's right.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, pushing the boundary.
Excellent. So one more. How do we go about launching and growing employee resource groups? Do they form organically? Have you seen HR create them? And how do you get employees excited about them so they engage?
Mm-hmm. I think that it's still challenging to try to figure out what the right process is and what that right balance is. There's some libraries like ours, we have hired a EDIA person, a specialist that is creating and providing some direction. And so that may be one particular approach, and whatever conversations this person might have with the organization to create what the different pathways are, then that might be one way. But as I have shared in this presentation, it comes down to a conversation by all. Why not have a town hall meeting? And we can have a town hall meeting now that's online, right? We don't have to necessarily meet in person. And why not have those conversations of what is it that our organization needs to look at, needs to look like in terms of not just representation, but how do we need to act and what can change? And what are the different ways that, do we integrate it into specific policies? Do some groups, form reading groups so then you can learn more about, because some people might not need to learn. They've already experienced and they've already been reading, and others people want to act or have different approaches and different ideas. So I think that it can be any source of balance approach, and it'll be the solution will be different for each organization.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chu. This has been a wonderful conversation, presentation, such great questions, more than we had time to get to. So your presentation will be recorded and available, and or it has been recorded and it will be available. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in many other ways in the future. Thank you so much, Dr. Chu.
You're welcome. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Contact me if you need anything.
Thank you.